So when we start comparing Neoplatonism or Platonic cosmology and Buddhism, it becomes apparent that they're actually fundamentally very different. So we can see on the left one of the earlier examples of a Greek celestial sphere. And that's a celestial sphere, not a terrestrial sphere, but we know very well, based on Plato's writings, that from the very beginning, the tradition understood the world to be a sphere. Whereas Buddhists conversely believe that the world was basically, the surface of the world was flat, and it was comprised of Mount Sumeru and the four continents, with the sun and the moon revolving around Mount Sumeru. And so it's fundamentally, physically, a very different cosmology, but also at a ontological level as well, and a metaphysical level too. They're very, very different. Buddhism also describes the emergence of the world in very different terms than what you find in Plato, such as Timaeus. So in earlier Buddhist literatures, particularly the Agamas, we read about a mass conflagration. So the previous world system, which is Mount Sumeru and the four continents, is basically burned up at the end of a period of time, and there's just absolute darkness. There's no sun or moon. There are some higher gods that continue living at like the higher heavens, and they look down and they actually see the conflagration. But for the most part, most of the beings are basically evaporated. But then Brahma is the first god to appear in this dark realm. And because he is the first to appear, he mistakenly thinks of himself as the creator of the world and all beings. And then the first devas, the gods, beings of light, they exist and they gain their luminosity, and they taste the sweetness of the earth, and then they lose their luminosity, and then they basically get addicted to the earth and the elements, and then they become coarse beings. So basically, before you have material beings on earth walking around, you have the devas, but they've basically fallen from their divinity because of their addiction to the sweet earth. And then in this sort of realm where things are just beginning to emerge, Mount Sumeru arises, and it's followed by the solar and lunar palaces that basically rise out of the sea and then start orbiting around Mount Sumeru and the four continents. So if you've read Timaeus, you know that this sort of cosmology is entirely different that Greek thinkers were proposing about. So, I mean, Timaeus talks about the demiurge crafting the world, and so it's also creationism or intelligent design. But in Buddhism, the world arises basically due to the collective karma of all beings. In Abhidharma literature, such as the Abhidharma Kosha, it's explicitly stated that the world arises from our collective karma. It's not just one being's karma, but many beings collectively bring the world into existence. And there's more than one world. Timaeus doesn't speak about multiple realms. Buddhists believe that we have one world system here, but there's also immeasurable world systems in all of the different directions. For example, in Mahayana literature, we also hear about like Amitabha Buddha in Sukhavati in the Western Pure Land, and there's immeasurable realms across the universe. So again, fundamentally very different. Here's another illustration. You can see that it's definitely not a sphere. It's more of like a cone shape, or sorry, like a sort of shaped like a tin or a can, cylinder shape, where the surface of it is flat, and then you have the water, the four continents, and then below that is gold and water. And so it's sort of like a cylinder suspended in space, and you have Mount Sumeru, which is surrounded by concentric rings of mountains. Each of them are of a lower altitude. And then on top of Mount Sumeru lives Indra, who is the famous god from the Vedas. And so he basically, in Buddhist literature too, it speaks of him throwing the asuras off of the top of the mountain and then taking it over for himself, which is similar. There's a parallel there to Zeus or Jupiter throwing the Titans off of Mount Olympus. So there's a sort of common Indo-European heritage there, but in the Buddhist worldview, they never adopted the sphere, whereas by Plato's time, Greeks had already adopted the sphere and they were comfortable with it. So this is the worldview of the Buddhists. And one thing that's also notable too is that in this early understanding of the world in Buddhism, there's no planets. There's only the sun and the moon, which revolve around Mount Sumeru. That's an interesting point because Plato was already aware of the existence of the planets, So in his generation, they already had systematic knowledge of the planets, so Jupiter and Saturn, etc. We kind of take that for granted in the modern day, but then most people, unless they actually take an interest in astronomy, can't necessarily point to Jupiter in the sky or Mercury. But in India, actually, the appearance of the planets is relatively late in the scientific literature, and it's even later in the religious literature. So, for example, Vasubandhu in the Abhidharma Kosha, writing in maybe the 3rd or the 4th century Common Era, doesn't have any knowledge of the planets. They speak of the stars and the sun and the moon, but not the planets. And the Buddhist worldview basically doesn't incorporate the planets until much later on. And even when Indian astronomers were using the sphere in the early centuries of the Common Era, Buddhists never adopted it. So because the Buddha himself taught this Mount Sumeru cosmology, I think it was basically not doctrinally or religiously feasible to adopt a sphere, even if they had wanted to. That leads to an interesting point, because in India, after a certain point, probably starting around like the 5th century or so, Brahmins had this idea of the Panchavidya, the 5 sciences, and one of them is mathematics and astronomy. So we can assume that educated Brahmins, the elites of society, probably actually knew that the world was a sphere, because they would have been trained in Indian astronomy, and all Indian astronomy from this time period treats the world as a sphere. But then in the religious context, they still treated the world as a flat earth. So there was probably a sort of contradiction there, but you don't actually see any hints of it in Buddhist literature. They just continued using this flat earth cosmology, whereas the Platonists did things very differently. And the Mount Sumeru cosmology was carried forth basically until the early modern period. So you can see here in the Edo period in Japan, there was Ensu, who basically was using this flat earth cosmology in his pedagogy. So this is an illustration from the Edo period of the actual physical model that they created of the world. So you can see that even up until the 19th century, Buddhists were still teaching Mount Sumeru in the 4 continents. Interestingly, I've been to the Himalayas, so like in Nepal and Himachal Pradesh, and I've spoken to lamas, and they told me that actually when they were going to Shedra, when they were basically in school, they were taught that the world is a flat earth and it's Mount Sumeru and the 4 continents. And then when they went to the city, they found out that the world was a sphere. So some Buddhists still actually teach this sort of cosmology, interestingly. Another thing that's fundamentally different from the cosmology of Plato is Plato and the Neoplatonists is also the starscape. So the Buddhists don't have the zodiac signs, because the zodiac signs originated in Mesopotamia, and then the Greeks adopted them following Hipparchus and the introduction of Mesopotamian astronomy into Greek. But they have nakshatras in India, so there's 28 lunar mansions, and the starscape is completely different, the constellations and so forth. And the other difference that's quite significant is that in Buddhism, the nakshatras are treated as devas or divinities. That's different from the Greek model, because the Greeks don't think of the constellations of the zodiac signs as being gods. Plato, of course, said that the stars are divine intelligences, but that's different from like the actual constellations of the zodiac signs being regarded as deities. Whereas in Buddhism, they regarded all 28 nakshatras as deities. And then later on, probably with Vedic influence, they assigned Vedic deities to each of the nakshatras, which is what you see in some of the literature associated with the Atharva Veda. So, for example, the Pleiades constellation, Kotyk, is associated with Agni. And so when you're worshiping Kotyk, you're also worshiping Agni. So that's another one of the fundamental differences between the 2 traditions. There's 28 of them in the Indian tradition. They're the same in Buddhism as they are in the Vedic tradition. So there was probably a sort of pan-Indian astrology that was available to both the Buddhists, the Hindus, but also the Jains and anybody else in India. So yeah, so the sphere, that's something that the Greeks adopted early on. It's very well attested, and also the cosmology of Platonism basically requires the spheres, because you have the celestial spheres, which we should all be familiar with. So here's a later Renaissance illustration of the celestial spheres, plus a few more that they added. So basically, you have the material sublunar world, which is our material sphere that we live on. And then above that is the lunar sphere going up to Saturn. So you have each of the spheres, and those are perfect, absolute, and their movements are basically immutable. And what that means, though, is that for people like Plotinus, for thinkers like Plotinus, it's inconceivable that there could be any sort of chaos in heavens, because the heavens, the visible heavens, anyways, are basically perfect and absolute, whereas the material world is chaotic and unpredictable. And of course, there's also the planets as well. So as I said, early Buddhists didn't know about the planets, but Plato definitely knew about them. And Plato also speaks of the planets as having an important function in the cosmos, because he talks of them as basically being what create time. So you have the sun, the moon, and then you have the 5 planets. And so their motions and their luminosity create time. And so this was the intention of Demiurge. And later, Iamblichus treats them as archons. So basically, they are the architect's creation, and they preside over different aspects of our reality. And Iamblichus, his influence in the magical tradition later on was quite profound. But you can also see here that early on, in, like, for example, the Roman period, the planets are being treated as divinities. And that goes back also to like a Mesopotamian precedent. So the reason that we refer to planet Jupiter using the name Jupiter is because for people back in antiquity, Jupiter, the star, the wandering star, the planet, was a physical or luminous expression of the god Jupiter. So that's why the names stick, and that goes back to Mesopotamia. So the Babylonian god Marduk was assigned the planet Jupiter. And so in the magical traditions of Rome and the Hellenistic world, planets also appear as divinities, and they're quite important as well. And then also in this later, Platonic thinking, and especially Iamblichus, they're basically the top of the hierarchy. So you have creation divided amongst these 7 archons, the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets, and then each of them have, daimons that operate under them within creation. This is very different from the Buddhist worldview. And then you also have the zodiac signs, which of course go back to Mesopotamia. The zodiac signs eventually appear in Buddhism, but that's much, much later on. That's like starting around the 4th and the 5th century Common Era. And the zodiac signs were sort of integrated into Indian cosmology, and they were basically running parallel to the nakshatras. So there's fundamentally some really big differences there. So gods, I've been talking about the planets as gods, but gods in general too. It's fundamentally very different because the Buddhist gods are mortal beings, and they can interact directly with the physical world, but they're fundamentally ignorant. So early Buddhist literature talks about Indra and all of his funny affairs and his, basically his ignorance, and then he basically has to learn from the Buddha, and then he becomes a stream enterer. So what that means is eventually he will become an arhat himself, maybe not in his present lifetime, but in a future lifetime. But the Buddha is an awakened being, and so he's also said to be the teacher of gods and men. And that's a pretty profound statement. So if you were to say that you could teach the gods something in front of Plato, Plato would have said that's absolutely absurd. And Plotinus would have said you're heretical, and Iamblichus would have laughed at you, because people do not teach the gods anything, because the gods metaphysically and intellectually are far superior to our mortal beings that we are. But also the gods in the Platonic worldview don't interact with the world directly. And so this goes back to the Symposium, where Diotima tells Socrates that the gods don't mingle with the world, but rather you have spirits or daimons that do that. So the intermediaries between the gods and humanity are the daimons. And that's very different in Buddhism, because the Buddhist worldview is full of gods. Sometimes the gods are up on Mount Sumeru. Indra stays up there, but in the literature, sometimes he comes down and he visits with the Buddha. Sometimes Brahma, this supreme, this even superior god, also learns something from the Buddha. And the whole world is full of devas. Some of them are like basically local gods. Some of them are profound gods, much more powerful gods. But basically, in the Buddhist worldview, humans and gods can coexist in the same space, whereas for Plato, for Plotinus, that's not feasible. That's not practical metaphysically. So yeah, the gods can descend, and even in the Agamas and also in the Nikayas, it also talks about Chandra and Surya, the moon and the sun gods, being devoured or harassed by Rahu, who causes the eclipses. So Rahu is associated with eclipses. He's basically the eclipse demon in the Vedas, and he has a role also in early Buddhist literature. And so Rahu assaults the sun and the moon, and the sun and the moon deities have to come to the Buddha and say, "Oh, please save us from Rahu." And then the Buddha banishes Rahu, and Rahu releases the sun and the moon. So that's a lot of Buddhists today wouldn't necessarily take that as like a literal historical story, but it's still in their literature. But it also just tells you from like a metaphysical point of view that the Buddha is superior even to the sun and the moon. And that means that he has a sort of like, I guess, like metaphysical status that's superior to all the gods, including even the sun and the moon. So what you find in Buddhism is you have lots of gods and goddesses, but they don't necessarily have any role as creators or architects or intelligences that oversee creation, but they're just sort of born into that because of their karma. And most of them are fundamentally ignorant, and they basically will eventually die and go forth into some other realm. Even in later traditions too, you have like depictions, like for example, from medieval Japan here, you have the descent of the 9 luminaries and the 7 stars at Kasuga. Kasuga is in Nara. So there's this, imagery of the gods coming down from heaven to visit the shrine or to visit the Buddha. And so this was kind of a consistent idea in Buddhism up until modern times. And so, but you wouldn't be able to convince Iamblichus that you could basically bring down the actual gods from the intelligible realm into the material world. It just wouldn't have been feasible. And so, for example, Iamblichus says that, like, even if you did, the fineness of the light which the gods radiate is such that the eyes of the body are not able to tolerate it, but even suffer the same thing as fishes when drawn from the muddy and thick wet elements to thin and transparent air. So he's suggesting that a human being exposed to the actual gods wouldn't be able to tolerate it. Whereas in Buddhism, they believe that it would be feasible if you could, if you interacted directly with the god. Especially, I think in Buddhism, they thought if you were like an arhat or Buddha or a bodhisattva, you'd be, the devas, the gods would be prostrating themselves before you and seeking your wisdom and guidance. So that's another profound difference. So if I'm an arhat, then I'm actually wisdom, like in terms of wisdom and intelligence, I'm actually superior to a god that's lived 500 million years. Like quite literally, if I'm an arhat, I'm actually better than Brahma. So Brahma might live 500 million years before he dies, but me living like 70 years or something like that and becoming an arhat, I've actually figured out the secret to nirvana and transcending samsara, whereas Brahma, in all of his long lifespan, is basically unable to realize that truth, that reality. So again, we're dealing with fundamentally very different cosmologies. And just because you're a god in Buddhism doesn't mean that you're not safe from falling into the hell realm. So we have this very interesting illustration from Dunhuang, the Chinese Buddhist tradition, which shows the beings basically being judged by Yama, and you can be reborn in all of these different destinies. So you can be reborn in hell. You can see the bottom one. You have the cauldrons, so you get chucked into a cauldron. And so if you're a god, you might live a very long time, and you might live a very good life in the heavens or on top of Mount Sumeru. But fundamentally, you could end up dying, and then your karma expires, and then you find yourself in the hell realms. So even the gods can be reborn in hell. That wouldn't work for Plotinus or Iamblichus at all, because they're basically separate from the material world altogether. Now, what's interesting too is that there are elemental deities in Buddhism that are sort of like carried over from the earlier, I guess, the heritage of Buddhism. I guess you could call it the Indo-Aryan. I'm kind of reluctant to say Vedic because I'm not really convinced that Magadha, the indigenous culture of Magadha, was strictly speaking Vedic. That seems to have been more in like Western India rather than Magadha. But in any case, familiar deities from the Vedas are still there in the Buddhist pantheon, such as Agni and Varuna, so the water, fire deity. But they don't really seem to have any sort of real function. Buddhists, instead of ejecting irrelevant gods, just sort of kept them in their cosmology. So you do have a god in the world who presides over fire, but he doesn't really have any role in the Buddhist world. In the Buddhist world, like he doesn't have any real function, other than that he's just there and people worship him, and presumably there's some sort of like ontological reality to what he does. Maybe he oversees fire, and it's his karma to do so, but the Buddhist literature doesn't really go into that because Buddhism is oriented towards liberation from samsara rather than kind of coming up with a polytheistic theology, but they just never ejected these deities even when they were, irrelevant. So you have the elemental deities there, and I guess you can draw some parallels too with Iamblichus, where he talks about the archons as intelligent architects and how do you say, the architects of creation will oversee things, but in this case they're not actually the intelligent designers of the world, because in Buddhism it's our collective karma that's shaping the world, not some sort of intelligent divinities at any level of the universe. Yeah, so this is just iterating what I just said. Buddhists believe that you can be reborn as a god yourself, and in early Buddhist literature as well, like kind of it's a second best option if you can't become awakened in your present lifetime. If you can't become an arhat in your present lifetime, well, then you should generate merit and hopefully be reborn in good circumstances. But Buddhist teachers will also tell you that if you are reborn as a god, it's actually somewhat tragic because you might actually not have the best circumstances to realize the wicked nature of samsara, because as a god, you don't experience a lot of the sort of obstacles and problems and sufferings and pains and toils that a human being would, because you're at like this higher state. So you're basically living a life of divine leisure potentially, in which case you don't really realize the nature of samsara. But in any case, it's a temporary state, whereas for Neoplatonists, it's inconceivable that a god could like basically fall down from that state. It's also, I mean, it's also because in Buddhism you have this idea not of souls or of selves. I mean, that's there's no Atman in Buddhism, but when you have is like a mental continuity from lifetime to lifetime, and so the gods are also subject to that as well. Whereas for Plotinus, we are descended souls in the material world, and even going beyond that too is like if the outside of the material world you don't have time and space as we experience it as human beings. For Buddhism, time is consistent and constant and absolute even at the divine level. So for Brahma also experiences time as well, whereas for the Neoplatonists there is no time for the gods because that's basically a feature of material reality. So Timaeus sets in motion the sun, the moon, and the stars, and that's, figuratively speaking, is the initiation of time in the material world. But for the gods in the intelligible realm, there is no time and space, at least as we experience it. Whereas for Buddhism, the gods actually do have a sense of time. Now, talking about astrology, Indian astrology was originally based on the 28 nakshatras, and then eventually they started adopting Hellenistic astronomy and astrology. And that was also the Hindu tradition as well. And so you can see from some of the archaeological evidence that the planets were incorporated also into like religious and ritual traditions, starting around, I guess, the 5th or the 6th century or so, the Gupta period. So what you're looking at here is a image of the Navagraha, so the 9 planets. So what you have is the sun, the moon, the 5 planets, and then Rahu and Ketu. So the Rahu and Ketu are basically connected with the moons. So Rahu is the ascending node of the moon, which basically is a point on the moon's orbit where if it intersects with the sun or the moon at a certain point, it causes an eclipse, or at least it is one of the configurations necessary for an eclipse to occur. And so they are basically entities that were introduced into Indian astronomy, and then eventually the religious traditions all adopted them. Of course, the Platonists don't have this. They have 7 planets. They don't have Rahu and Ketu. So you have these additional 2 pseudo-planets. They're not real like entities in the sky that you can see, but rather they're just astronomical functions. And so you have a different set of planets in India than you do in the Greek world. So the planets become regarded as deities, and they affect the fortunes of people. And in Buddhism, when you have the introduction of the planets, it's kind of gradual. It starts with Mahayana literature, starting around the fifth century maybe. But then once you get to the esoteric stuff, the Vajrayana, the Tantric tradition, they become much more important. But the planets in Buddhist literature can fall out of order, which would signal an imminent disasters. This is an important point. So in India, there was this idea that the planets can fall out of their orbits, which mean that they're not following the predicted orbits that you would expect them to follow. And if that happens, even if they're like off by a couple of degrees, this signals that there's going to be an imminent disaster. So rituals have to be performed, pujas have to be performed to sort of prevent any sort of disasters from occurring. Now, for Plotinus, he sees the planetary motions as absolutely perfect, and it's the human observation that would err, but the planets do not. The motions of the planets do not err because they're absolutely perfect, because it's above the material world. We're in the sublunar world. Things are chaotic, unpredictable here, but the motions of the planets are absolute. So there's a fundamental difference there between how they're viewing the planets and the stars. And we can also see the sort of pantheon that appears in the Buddhist tradition. This is a document from Japan, the Taizo Zuzo, which is an iconography manual that was brought over from China sometime in the 9th century. It's a copy of something from around 724. But you can see Rahu and Ketu there. So Rahu has his hands grasping for the sun and the moon because he causes eclipses. And so this is also when you have the sort of anthropomorphization of the planets in Buddhism, and especially in East Asia, but also in India as well. So before this time, the planets in these sort of forms don't exist because there's no knowledge of the planets. So they're sort of like they're introduced to the pantheon, the Buddhist pantheon, relatively late, like, starting around the 5th to the 6th century Common Era. Whereas for Plato, the planets were already there from the very beginning, and then they're discussed at great length, and their role in the cosmos in Plotinus and also in Iamblichus. And also, the Buddhists don't really have problems with astrology, which is quite in contrast to Plotinus and Iamblichus. There's very few instances I found where Buddhists are actually critical about the validity of astrology itself. The main problem that Buddhists had with astrology was if you're a monk, you shouldn't be practicing it in order to gain a livelihood. So you maybe gain some expertise in astrology, and you try to acquire like cash offerings or some sort of material substance livelihood from the lay people by practicing astrology. And the Vinaya, the monastic code, say you're not supposed to be doing this. Nevertheless, we know that Buddhist monks were still doing this because they were educated and literate in many cases, so they actually had the know-how to do this. So the point is that Buddhists generally considered astrology to be invalid, but it was a worldly science because it's not directed at liberation from samsara. Because if you're a Buddhist monk, your job is to generate merit and to liberate yourself from samsara, to aid other beings in their pursuit of liberation. You're not supposed to be practicing astrology or doing, painting or accounting or any other worldly science. You're doing other things. But astrology was also adopted into the various practices of Buddhism. So starting in the late 7th century, especially, Buddhists started using astrology for rituals. So if you're going to do a puja, create a mandala, then you have to also time it according to astrology. And it can't just be some random time. It can't just be on a Sunday. You have to look at the configuration of the planets. You have to look at the time of the day of the week, all sorts of features. So it becomes actually important, if not critical, to the project of Tantric Buddhism. Because in Tantric Buddhism, they have this idea that you can rapidly accelerate liberation. So in old Mahayana, it takes 3 incalculable aeons, like millions, hundreds of millions of lifetimes to go from a aspiring bodhisattva to a full Buddha. So there's the 10 stages, the bhumis. That's going to take a very long time, but the Tantric tradition says that this is possible in one lifetime, theoretically. But in order for this to work, you have to perform certain rituals, you have to create the mandala. And in order to get this done properly, you have to time it according to astrology. What this means is that astrology becomes necessary for awakening. I'll say that again. Astrology becomes necessary for awakening in Tantric Buddhism. You cannot ignore astrology. It's an essential part of the program in order to become awakened in a single lifetime. And so as a result of that, you also have astral deities appearing in the mandalas. So this is a copy, one of the copies of the Taizo mandala in Japan, the Garbhadatta mandala. And so you can see that there's some familiar zodiac signs here. You have Libra holding up the scale, you have Sagittarius the bowman, you have Scorpio, who kind of looks like a strange cross between a scorpion and a prawn. And you also have the moon deity there holding the lunar disk with the hair inside it. So very clearly, the astral figures became part of the pantheon of Tantric Buddhism. When we look at Plotinus, it's a bit different because he thought that the astrologers were gravely mistaken. He thought that the stars might signal things, but he fundamentally disagreed with the astrologers that planets were emotionally influenced by their configuration in the heaven relative to one another. So basically, astrologers propose that the planets, when they're in certain configurations, when they are, for example, conjunct together, they might be happy, they might be angry, and that this somehow has an influence on a person based on their birth chart, their horoscope. So he fundamentally disagreed with that. And he also disagreed that the planets could have any sort of like ill will towards people, because the astrologers at the time basically framed it as like a malefic force, so that in certain circumstances, Saturn was going to harm you personally, and that Mars was going to harm you personally, or it might cause Venus might cause you to like run out and commit adultery. He was fundamentally opposed to this idea, and he in the Enneads and also Iamblichus too, they basically take the astrologers to task and say that they're fundamentally wrong, because from their cosmological point of view, it doesn't make sense for planets to be upset over what people are doing or to have any sort of ill will to them, because they are outside of the material world and they operating in the intelligible realm. So it just doesn't make sense in their cosmology. Whereas for Buddhists, they're quite fine with the idea that the planets, the Navagraha, can influence your life and cause all sorts of problems. So just to wrap up, these are some of my observations having read the two traditions. Basically, the Platonic thinkers held that the world is a sphere surrounded by the celestial spheres. The sublunar world is material, chaotic, and a coarse image of the forms of the intelligible realm. So what that means is that we have our material world with all of its chaos and unpredictability, but at the intelligible realm, also above the lunar sphere, including the lunar sphere up to the Saturn sphere, that's perfect, absolute, and predictable and not chaotic. The Buddhist worldview, however, is Mount Sumeru and the four continents, and humans, gods, everybody coexists together in the same time and space. So the gods of the intelligible realm in the Platonic worldview are not subject to time and space, whereas in Buddhism, even the highest gods, such as Brahma, are subject to time and space, and also material beings can interact with gods. For Plato and Iamblichus and Plotinus, people did not directly interact with gods, as Diotima taught Socrates. Again, the gods are part of the material world. Daimons might interact with people, because they're the intermediaries between the gods and men. But Buddhism doesn't have this idea at all. The Buddhist worldview too, I mean, there's Nagas and there's all sorts of other sort of supernatural entities that inhabit our world. And you might even interact with them sometimes, but that's different from the idea of daimons, because the daimons are actually on a mission. The daimons are under the direct control of one of the divine hierarchies. So to borrow from Iamblichus, there's the archon, and then there's the archangels, the angels, and then the daimons are under them in the hierarchy, and they're basically operating on behalf of the gods in our reality. Buddhism doesn't have this idea at all, mostly because there's no sense of intelligent design in the Buddhist worldview. Whereas for the Platonic tradition, there's definitely a intelligence overseeing creation. Buddhists believe that the planets can fall out of their orbits, and it's necessary to do pujas to correct this. Whereas Plotinus, like his peers, they viewed planetary orbits as absolute. So, for example, even the astronomers of the Hellenistic world, such as Ptolemy, the running assumption was that the orbits of the planets are absolute, and if our observations are wrong, it's our error, it's not the planets. Whereas for Buddhists, they thought that if the planets are not in their proper orbits, then there's something wrong with the planets, not us. So there's a fundamental difference there. Buddhists generally believed in astrology, but they thought it was a worldly art, so they didn't want monks making money from it or gaining a livelihood. And Plotinus and Iamblichus had sort of mixed feelings about this because they thought that the stars could signal things on Earth, but they fundamentally disagreed that the planets could be malefic or benefic toward people. So they didn't think that the planets had some sort of personality and that they had sort of ill will. They could have ill will towards people because cosmologically that didn't make sense for them. In short, Buddhists held that the planets in the world are all samsara, chaotic and mortal. And astrology works because the planets influence our lives, but it's still a worldly science. Maybe you could say in the tantric tradition, it's less of a worldly science because they still have to time their rituals according to astrology. So it becomes more important over time. Plotinus held that the planets and gods operate outside the chaotic material world, and the astrologers were wrong about the planets, but the stars could still signal things. So basically, we're looking at two very, very different traditions.